Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1873. The wind carried the smell of frost and pine when she stepped off the eastbound stage near the edge of Sheridan, holding a baby close against her chest. The town barely noticed her. Dust swirled around the wheels of the departing stagecoach, and the driver tipped his hat, more out of habit than kindness. She stood quietly, her shawl wrapped tight, one carpetbag at her feet, and her arms wrapped around the baby bundled in a worn quilt. Her name was Arden Collins, 23 years old. Her boots cracked from miles of walking before the ride that brought her here. The baby stirred. A boy, maybe 5 months. His name was Wyatt. She looked up the road that led nowhere fast, just out to the open fields and cattle country. She had no one in this town. No one at all. Except maybe him. He was just a stranger at first, watching from the corral fence outside the feed store. One boot hooked on the bottom rail, arms crossed over his chest, eyes shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. He looked like every other cowboy in the West until he moved. Confident, quiet, like a man who had lost things and stopped talking about them. He did not stare the way some men did, just watched, curious and steady. Arden lifted her chin and picked up the bag with one hand, adjusting Wyatt with the other. She walked past the corral, her boots crunching over gravel. "Ma'am," the cowboy said, voice even and low. "You looking for someone?" She stopped. Her eyes found his. He was older than her by a few years, maybe 28. Tall, tan from sun and wind. His shirt was rolled to the elbows, dust clinging to his jeans, a rifle slung behind his saddle not far from reach. "I was," she said, "but he is dead." The cowboy nodded once, like he understood more than she had said. "My name's Vance Holler," he offered, stepping down from the fence. "You got a place to go?" "No," Arden said plainly. "Not anymore." Wyatt whimpered. She bounced him gently, shifting her weight to soothe him. Her arms were tired. Her back ached. She had not eaten since dawn. Vance looked at the baby, then at her hands red and raw. His eyes softened. "You hungry?" he asked. She said nothing for a beat, then nodded. Vance stepped aside and motioned across the street. "There's a diner. I can get you something." She hesitated. "I will not ask questions," he added, reading her silence. That was enough. Inside the diner, warmth filled her cheeks. The baby rested against her collarbone, finally quiet. Vance ordered stew and coffee and sat across from her without pressing for anything more. His hands were calloused, clean. His gaze steady. "Thank you," she said after a while, spooning bits of meat into her mouth slowly. "Do you have family anywhere?" he asked. She looked down. "No friends." "No," he nodded again, not pushing. "My husband died in Kansas," she said, voice quiet. "It was not a good marriage. He died in a fight outside a saloon. I was left with debts and a baby. His family wanted nothing to do with either of us." Vance leaned back slightly, jaw tight. "I came here because he had told me once about work near Sheridan, that they needed school teachers. But I arrived and found the job filled 2 months ago." She looked up at him. "I have no plan past today." Vance did not say anything for a while. Then he reached into his coat pocket and laid a small brass key on the table. "I have a homestead 2 miles out," he said. "Small. 1 room. But there is a barn and a stove and no one else." She stared at the key. "I do not expect anything," he said, voice level. "But it is getting cold. And you should not be alone tonight." Arden's throat tightened. She tucked Wyatt's blanket closer under his chin. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Vance looked at her, his voice quiet now. "Because I have been alone too long. And because you look like you have been carrying everything by yourself for miles." That night, she rode beside him in the wagon, her baby asleep against her chest. The moon lit the trail, and the wind moved gently through the grass. Vance did not speak much, but he glanced her way often, checking if she was warm, if she needed anything. His coat was draped over her shoulders. His homestead was just as he said. Small, clean, with a warm barn and a little porch. He unhitched the horse and brought her inside, lit a fire, stirred something on the stove. She stood near the hearth, arms still around her boy. "We can take the bed," he said, nodding toward the corner. "I will sleep in the barn." "You do not have to, I want to," he said. She swallowed. He paused at the door. "If you want to stay longer than tonight, you are welcome. No strings." Then he stepped outside with a blanket and a lantern. Arden stood in the quiet. The baby stirred, and she kissed his forehead. Her hands trembled as she laid him down on the bed, her shoulders sagging. For the first time in months, she did not have to keep moving. Outside, snow began to fall. In the morning, there was coffee on the stove and a note folded neatly on the table. "Back soon. Woodpile needs stacking. Coffee is strong. Do not let it fool you." She smiled before she realized it. Wyatt kicked his feet softly on the bed. She stayed. One day turned into 3, then a week. Vance never asked for anything. He worked the land, fixed the fence, brought her books for the baby from town. In the evenings they sat near the fire. Sometimes he read aloud. Sometimes they just listened to the wind. He made her laugh. She had not laughed in a long time. One night, after Wyatt had fallen asleep, she looked up from her sewing and found Vance watching her. Not with pity, not with hunger, just something honest. "You said you have been alone too long," she said. He nodded. "I do not want to be alone anymore," she whispered. Vance stood slowly, walked over, and knelt beside her chair. He reached for her hand, held it gently. "I will not let you be," he said. "Not if you let me stay." She touched his cheek, and for the first time, she believed her life was not just something to survive, but something that could be good again. She came with a baby in her arms, and he took them both into his heart. By late November, the wind had turned sharp and unforgiving. The mountains to the west wore their snow like old men wear silence, and every step outside left breath hanging in the air like lace. Arden had begun rising before the sun, easing Wyatt from his quilts and wrapping him close to her with practiced arms. In the low light of morning, she moved about the cabin with a quiet purpose, careful not to wake Vance when he returned from the barn too worn to speak. She had not asked what time he began his work, but the wood was always stacked high before the rooster called, and the cow was milked before she touched her apron. That morning, as she poured warm milk into a pan, Vance stepped inside with his collar dusted in frost and his eyes soft with fatigue. He rubbed his hands together and leaned near the stove. "You ever help a cow birth a calf?" he asked. She looked up from the pan. "No, but I watched a mare foal once, back in Missouri. I was 12. He nodded, eyes on the flicker of the stove flame. "One of the heifers is about to drop. Could be today. Maybe tomorrow." She stirred the milk slowly. "Will she need help?" "Maybe. She's young. Her hips are narrow." Arden glanced toward the cradle. "I can sit with her if you want, while you check fences." Vance looked at her then, really looked. "You don't mind?" "I want to be useful," she said. He exhaled through his nose and gave a small, grateful nod. "You already are." Later that day, Vance hitched the wagon and left for the far pasture with tools tied down under a canvas tarp. Arden pulled on her shawl, tucked Wyatt into a sling across her chest, and walked to the barn. The heifer stood uneasy, her sides tense with the ache of coming labor. Arden moved slow, speaking low and steady, running her hand down the animal's back. She remembered her mother's voice in the dark of a birthing room, how calm could travel through skin like heat through a kettle. Wyatt slept against her ribs, his breath warm through the cloth. The barn was quiet but for the shifting of hooves and the rustle of hay. By mid-afternoon, the heifer lay down trembling. Arden knelt beside her, whispering encouragement, fingers brushing sweat from the animal's hide. She saw the calf's legs first, slick and white-tipped. It was a difficult push, long and breathless, but when the calf finally spilled out into the straw, Arden wept. The heifer nosed her calf, and it blinked against the light. She was still wiping her cheeks when Vance returned. He stepped into the barn, saw the calf standing on wobbly legs, and stopped in his tracks. "You did that?" he asked, voice hushed. Arden stood slowly, brushing straw from her skirts. "She did most of it. I just talked to her." He stepped closer, his boots quiet on the barn floor. "Look strong." "She is," Arden said. "A girl." Vance looked at her, then really looked. His eyes didn't move away. "You got away with the herding," he said. Arden wrapped her shawl tighter around her. "I've seen enough of it to know how to sit beside it." He nodded, and something passed between them that didn't need naming. That evening, after the baby was down and the fire banked low, Vance hauled a bucket of water inside and set it near the hearth. He glanced over at her as she folded one of Wyatt's shirts. "You ever think about staying past the thaw?" he asked. She set the shirt aside. "I've thought about it." He watched the fire for a while before speaking again. "I never wanted much beyond quiet. Land to work. A place no one could take." She waited. "But lately," he continued, "I find myself thinking about 2 more chairs at the table, and a line of clothespins strung out on a warm day." Arden's breath caught. She folded her hands in her lap. "I don't know how to be a husband," he said. "Not in the way books talk about, but I can build things, fix things, protect what matters." She stood slowly and crossed to him, kneeling by the firewood he was stacking. "I don't want a man from a book," she said. "I want one who knows how to stay." His hands stilled. Then he reached for her fingers and held them without words. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the silence was full. By early December, the ground had hardened beneath a brittle crust of snow, and the air carried a silence that settled deep into the bones. Arden learned the rhythm of the homestead without needing to ask when to pull kindling from the stack beside the porch, how long to leave the kettle before the water turned bitter, and the small sounds Vance made when he was thinking but didn't want to speak. She had begun sewing curtains from old flour sacks, softening the cabin's edges with quiet care. Each night, once Wyatt was tucked in his cradle and the lamp turned low, she mended shirts and stitched hems while Vance carved small shapes from scrap with his hands steady. His eyes focused on the grain like it told him secrets. One night, as snow pattered soft against the roof, she paused her stitching and nodded toward the small pile of wooden animals on the shelf. "You always carve?" she asked. He nodded, setting down his knife. "Started after I got back from New Mexico. Keeps my hands from wandering where they shouldn't." She folded the muslin in her lap. "You were a soldier?" "Scout, mostly. Rode with a company near Fort Craig for 2 years. Then I came north." He said nothing more, but his jaw tightened. "You lose someone?" she asked gently. Vance's eyes stayed on the fading coals. "2 brothers. Younger than me. They joined up back in '62, both full of fire. Only one came home, and he didn't last long." Arden didn't press. After a long moment, he looked at her. "You ever have anyone who saw you clear? Before all the trouble?" She thought for a while. "There was a teacher once, back home in Boone County. She told me I carried more than I should for a girl my age. Said I'd either break or become something strong." He nodded like he understood what that meant. The wind shifted outside. The cabin creaked softly. "I never imagined myself out here," she said, voice hushed. "Not like this." You regret it? She shook her head. No, I just don't know who I'm allowed to be now. I was a wife, but not in the way that mattered. Then I was just a mother, with no roof and no kin. Vance leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You can be whatever you want out here. There's room for that. No one to say otherwise. She studied his profile, how the firelight caught the worn line of his cheek, the scar near his temple that curved like a question mark. What do you see when you look at me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, slow and deliberate. I see a woman who didn't lay down when the world told her to. I see someone who carries on even when it hurts. Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. And what do you want from me? Not a thing, he said. Except maybe to keep waking up in the same place as you. She reached for his hand. He let her take it. His fingers were rough, but his grip was careful, like he knew how easily things could slip. Later, when the oil lamp flickered low, she rested her head against his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, no words between them, just the sound of Wyatt breathing soft and the fire settling down to ash. In the stillness, Vance whispered, I can build a second room come spring. Give you space if you want it. She didn't lift her head. What if I want less space? He didn't answer, but his thumb moved gently along the back of her hand. The next morning, they rose before dawn. Vance led the mare out to check the lower fence line, and Arden stayed with Wyatt, feeding him bread soaked in milk while humming a tune she hadn't thought about in years. When Vance returned before midday, his coat dusted with snow, he brought back a bundle wrapped in canvas. He set it on the table and untied the knots. Inside was a bolt of blue calico, a tin of buttons, and a wrapped parcel of sugar. Arden touched the fabric, her hands still from surprise. You didn't have to, she murmured. I know, he said, but I wanted to see what you'd make with it. She looked up at him. You think about us? Often, he said, especially when I'm out riding. I think about you laughing. About that boy of yours growing tall with dirt on his knees. She smiled, quiet and full. I think about building something that don't come apart. She stepped forward, resting a hand against his chest. His heart beat steady beneath her palm. Then stay close, she said. And don't go looking for anything better than this. He cupped her cheek, his touch gentle as snowfall. There ain't better, he said. And when he kissed her, it was slow and sure, like he was making a promise without needing to say a word. The days shortened beneath a sky the color of iron. December settled in full, not with storm but with the quiet weight of deepening cold. The cabin held its heat well, thanks to the thick logs and the way Vance packed the chinks with moss and clay weeks before the first frost. Still, Arden kept Wyatt close in her shawl as she swept the floor and turned the bread dough by hand, listening to the steady creak of the windmill just beyond the barn. Vance had gone into town that morning to speak with the farrier about a loose shoe on the mare. He'd offered to bring back more lamp oil and a spool of thread if she wrote down the color she needed. She'd torn off a bit of paper and scrawled black in her careful hand, then tucked it into his coat pocket as he bent to kiss her temple. She hadn't realized how long the cabin stayed quiet without his boots crossing the floor, without his low humming while he sawed wood or cleaned his tools beside the stove. Wyatt was content, batting at a string she'd tied from the rafter, but Arden found herself pausing mid-stitch, eyes drifting to the door as if it might open early. By mid-afternoon, a knock came, not the door swinging open, but a single knock, sharp and unfamiliar. She shifted Wyatt to her hip and opened it slowly. A man stood on the stoop, tall and broad-shouldered, a full beard rimmed with ice and a patched wool coat that had seen many seasons. His hat was in his hands, which were red from the wind. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough but not unkind. "I'm looking for Vance Holler." Arden didn't move. "He's in town," she answered. "Won't be back till sundown." The man nodded once and looked past her into the cabin. Not rude, just cautious. Name's Levi. I rode with Vance down near the Jornada when the war was still hot. He ever mention me? She shook her head. Well, he said, glancing toward the barn. I thought I'd stop by. Got a small claim west of here, past the ridge. Been wondering if your man'd be willing to help me fence it come thaw. Arden stepped outside, pulling the door close behind her. He'd want to hear you out himself. Levi's eyes dropped to the baby at her hip. That your boy? She nodded, not offering more. Looks well, he said after a pause. Vance always talked about wanting a quiet place. Guess he found it. She didn't answer. The wind picked up, rifling her skirt and catching at the corners of her shawl. You need anything before I ride on? Levi asked. I've got a sack of flour and some dried apples in my saddlebag. Traded for more than I need. Arden hesitated, then nodded once. Dry goods are always welcome. He turned and walked to his horse, unstrapped the items and brought them back, setting them gently on the porch. Tell him I stopped by, he said, and that I meant what I said about help. She met his eyes then. He's not my man. Levi tilted his head. No, she adjusted Wyatt's blanket. He might be. Soon. A flicker of something passed through Levi's expression. Not surprise. Something quieter. Then he tipped his head. Well, you tell him this place suits him. And you do too. He rode off without another word, his horse's hooves crisp against the frozen ground. When Vance returned, dusk was folding over the prairie and the sky had turned a dusty rose. His arms were full of supplies, and his cheeks red from the cold. She met him at the door. You had a visitor, she said. Levi. Said he knew you from before. Vance set the parcel down and rubbed his hands together. He's still carrying that old Colt with the ivory grip? She nodded. He chuckled once. He carved that handle out of a mule's jawbone. Spent a week filing it smooth. He asked if you'd help him fence his land come spring. I will. She stepped closer. He saw us. Called you my man. Vance looked at her carefully. That bother you? No, she said, voice low. I told him it might be true. Soon. He reached forward and brushed a lock of hair from her brow. You sure? He asked. Ain't no shame in needing more time. She leaned into his hand. I had years of time that led nowhere. I'd rather walk forward now. He kissed her, soft and steady, as the wind hummed against the cabin walls. Later that night, after Wyatt had drifted to sleep and the fire was low, Vance pulled a small box from the top shelf of the cupboard. He set it on the table between them. I carved this years ago, he said. Didn't know what for, just that I needed to make it. She opened the lid. Inside lay a ring, the band shaped from bone, polished smooth, a small blue stone set into the center. I didn't plan on asking you yet, he said. Not until you said the word first. She lifted the ring gently, turning it in the lamplight. Would you want to wear it? He asked. She slid it onto her finger. Fit as though made for her alone. I would. Vance smiled, not wide, but deep. You and the boy, he said, voice quiet. You're home now. She reached across the table and took his hand. Yes, she whispered. We are. The last snow came in early March, thick and wet, blanketing the pasture in a hush that made the world feel paused. Vance had just finished patching the lean to behind the barn when the first flakes started to fall, and by dusk, the cabin roof held a soft white crown. Inside, the lantern burned low on the table while Arden stood at the wash basin, sleeves rolled, her hands red from scrubbing Wyatt's shirts. Vance watched her from the doorway, shoulder leaning against the frame. You ever think about naming this place? She wrung out cloth and hung it over the line near the stove. "Name it what?" He shrugged. "Folks usually call their land something, once they settle for good. Gives it a kind of weight." She sat down and pulled Wyatt into her lap, smoothing his curls with her palm. "Something rooted, then. I'd want that." He moved to sit across from her. "Reckon we could call it what we mean to make of it." She tilted her head. "And what's that?" He reached across and brushed a bit of lint from her sleeve. "A home that holds, no matter what blows through it." She looked down at Wyatt, who had begun to hum himself into sleep. "Then call it Stillhouse. Still because it's steady. House, because it's more than shelter now." Vance nodded once, like something had clicked into place. Stillhouse it is. By late March, the snows thinned and the river near the far bluff began to run again. Vance took to riding the perimeter each morning to check for winter damage, and Arden began planting early onion sets in the thawed patch near the porch. She made a sling for Wyatt from an old wool shawl so she could keep him close while digging. He babbled at the crows and chewed his fingers, content to sway against her back while she worked. That Sunday, Vance hitched the wagon and drove them to the chapel 3 miles east. A one-room place with hand-planed pews and a bell that rang hollow against the wind. The preacher's wife greeted Arden with warm palms and a bundle of dried lavender, whispering that her boy had the look of a sky-born spirit. Vance sat beside her, his boots clean and his hair combed, one hand resting quiet on her knee beneath the hymnal. After the service, as folks milled about the yard and the preacher's horse nibbled at the fence post, Vance turned to her. "I could ask him now, if you'd want that." Arden looked down at her hands. "We don't need anything more to be what we already are." "No," he said, "but I'd like to say it out loud with you beside me. For the record, for the land, for the boy." She looked up, the wind catching her hair. "Then ask." He stepped away just enough to catch the preacher's attention. A few quiet words passed between them. The preacher nodded, then smiled. They married beneath a cottonwood still bare from winter, with the river just beyond and the preacher's wife holding Wyatt. The wind tugged at Arden's skirt, and Vance took her hands with a steadiness that made her breath still in her throat. The vows were simple sickness, health, and never letting go. When the words were said, and the preacher clasped their hands together, Vance kissed her with both eyes open. On the ride back, Wyatt slept in Arden's arms, and Vance held the reins loose, the team trotting slow through the muddy road. "I never thought I'd say vows again," she said softly. He glanced over. "You didn't before. Not real ones." She looked down at the sleeping boy. "I thought I'd be ruined by what came before, like nothing good could grow after it. And now," she turned her head to him, "now I feel like the ground's turning soft again, like I can put roots down." That evening, they ate supper with the windows open to the warming air. Vance had salted pork in town the day before, and Arden made biscuits from the last of the flour Levi had traded. Afterward, they sat on the porch and listened to the frogs start up down by the creek. Vance pulled a folded envelope from his coat and handed it to her. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter from the township clerk, printed in fine hand on cream paper. Claim registered under Arden Collins, Stillhouse homestead, Wyoming Territory. She smiled, tracing the edge of the paper. "You put my name on it." He watched her face. "Always meant to, just waited for the right moment." She folded the paper and slid it into her apron. "You're not the only one who can carve." He raised a brow. She stood and went inside, returning a moment later with a small wooden comb, its teeth fine, the back carved with a pattern of prairie grass and a single star. "Made it for you. Keeps your hair from tangling when the wind's up." He took it, running his thumb over the grain. "That's the first gift I've been given in years." She stepped between his knees and rested her hands on his shoulders. "Won't be the last." He slid his arms around her waist and drew her in. They stayed like that, wrapped in the hush of a land thawing back to life. When the stars came out, they carried Wyatt inside together. Vance banked the fire while Arden laid out the quilts she'd pieced through the long winter nights. They undressed in silence, the quiet kind that came from knowing every breath the other would take. When they lay down, she rested her head on his chest, and he curled a hand around hers. "You ever think about more?" she asked in the dark. "Children? Yes. I'd raise as many as you're willing to carry." She smiled against his skin. "One at a time." He kissed her forehead. "However they come." Spring bloomed slow but certain. The calf Arden had helped birth grew strong and was named Grace. The onions sprouted green and sharp, and Vance repaired the upper fence with Levi's help come April. Wyatt took his first steps in the grass behind the barn, chasing chickens with toddling delight. Arden began teaching him songs from her childhood, and Vance carved him a tiny fiddle from cherry wood. They built the second room by midsummer. Arden painted the door pale blue, and Vance hung the horseshoes above it for luck. One night, with a storm rumbling far off and Wyatt asleep beneath a quilt, Arden stood by the window and watched the lightning paint the fields in silver. Vance came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "Still glad you stayed?" he asked. She turned, resting her hands on his chest. "I didn't stay. I came home." They kissed, and outside, the wind moved gentle through the grass. The days stretched out ahead of them, full of fences to mend, bread to bake, and children yet to come. Stillhouse stood solid against the sky, a place made not just of logs and earth, but of the quiet love that had grown between them, slow and true. They never left. They never needed to.